Welcome everyone then to this session in intercultural philosophy. I do want to address the very term and title of this session. What is intercultural philosophy? Let's think some about this this space of the inter, and the difference that that makes to our philosophizing. Actually, my whole title is an outline of an intercultural philosophy of universalism. And I do want to suggest that in some sense, the universal today is accessible to us through intercultural philosophy. I'm going to put up my homepage here. Now, what I'm working from is actually a book that came out this year called Apophatic Paths from Europe to China, Regions Without Borders. And there's an image of that as well. It's published by SUNY Press, State University of New York Press, this year in the series edited by Roger Ames on Chinese philosophy and culture. We'll see if it comes up. I have been working for many years on what I call an apophatic philosophy, a philosophy of the unsayable, and that is the title of a book that came out in 2014, which is the sequel to 2 volumes called On What Cannot Be Said, Apophatic Discourses in Philosophy, Literature, Religion, and the Arts. And what I've done now in this more recent book, Apophatic Paths from Europe to China, is to take an apophatic philosophy, turning on, obviously, negation, apophasis, the Greek word for negation, in the direction of culture, and specifically of the intercultural. I do really want to propose that our thinking has to come out of this space of the inter in order to become universal, which has in some ways been the aim of philosophy since its beginnings, certainly in Greece, with the revelation of the logos to our pre-Socratic philosophers, and then systematized in certain ways by Plato and Aristotle. A universal thinking in certain ways has also been the aim, I believe, in Chinese philosophy. I would extend that to Indian philosophy. The aim of a discourse that is valid, without limits of culture, language, some kind of a universal validity has been an aim of philosophy whenever and wherever it has occurred. However, each of these philosophies turns out to be regional, provincial, to belong to a certain culture, unless it can move into the space of the inter. It is really between cultures that the universal becomes possible for us. It becomes possible only as what cannot be defined in any given language, what has no specific paradigm that takes on the form of a conceptual system. Every conceptual system is exclusive. And it's only in moving between them from one to another that we're able to attain this dimension of the universal. The universal then belongs to what I'm calling the unsayable. Of course, positing the unsayable makes it too into a kind of paradigm. But the point, the intention behind speaking of the unsayable is to undo exactly that inevitable propensity of our thought and language to objectify, to crystallize, to render thinking into some sort of a static, immovable object. The intercultural is the challenge for us to think between all of these paradigms in which this dimension of universality can arise. Now, this book is very much in dialogue with the eminent French philosopher of culture, François Julien. I am not a sinologist by training. Julien is a philosopher and a sinologist, and his works enabled me to enter into a kind of conversation with Chinese, particularly classical Chinese thinking, having come from the Western traditions that I alluded to before, naming the titles of these works. On What Cannot Be Said moves from Plato's Parmenides through Neoplatonism, medieval mysticism, Baroque mysticism, through Romanticism, all the way up to postmodern discourses, all of them being apophatic in various ways. And that project within Western philosophy then was taken to the East with the help of my readings of François Julien and some work together with him in France at certain conferences. Now, as is typical of French rive gauche philosophers, they're very secular-minded. And Julien's project, like that of most of his postmodern contemporaries, is anti-theological. The idea of going to China is that we have, and this has been current since the 18th century, a kind of thinking that has no need of God, right? A secular system, the Confucian thinking, was generally portrayed this way. It was discovered, even in the 18th century in particular. Of course, you have in the 16th century already Matteo Ricci going to China with the Christian missions. And I should mention that I myself went to China following on the tracks of Matteo Ricci from 2013 to 2016. I was professor and chair of philosophy and religious studies at the University of Macau. And that is where this work was done in the graduate seminars with the students who would bring their backgrounds from Taoist, Confucian philosophy to our discussions into comparison with the Western sources that I was presenting and expounding. And so this work on apophatic paths from Europe to China comes out of that dialogue. And contrary then to the emphasis of Julien and French postmodern thinking, my emphasis is rather on a dimension that I'm calling apophatic. It can be called negative theological as well. Theology is an essential partner in dialogue for the kind of philosophy that I propose. Of course, this is negative theology. That is not just one positive paradigm of dogmatic theology, but rather theology as the spirit of critique. Negative theology is the vital challenge to idolatry. Beginning already in ancient sources, in the Old Testament, the prophets are already fulminating against the idolatry that becomes rampant in any tradition. Any tradition evolves the icons that enable its worship to be carried on, and that has to be critiqued because the sense of the divine is always beyond any human production, any making of human hands, such as those stone idols representing gods. The prophets are already very much onto this. It goes on all the way to our contemporary society. You take a philosopher like Theodor Adorno and his negative dialectic. Negative dialectics is still a form of trying to critique and thereby undo conceptual idolatry. All of our language itself becomes idolatrous because of the tendency of language to fix and objectify our thinking, which is necessary in order for us to be able to construct conceptual systems, but also carries with it its own downfall into false representation. The truth fleetingly shines in discourse, and when that discourse becomes frozen into formulas, it no longer can perform the function of revealing truth that it does in these moments of revelation. And I do then look very much to religious revelation as being a kind of model for what philosophy is doing as well. Of course, there's the constant tension between philosophy and religion, mutos and logos, and philosophy comes on the scene as the critique of mutos in ancient Greece, and rightly so. But of course, logos itself turns into a myth eventually. Logos is that critical moment, the critical moment represented by negative theology. It remains inevitably in dialogue with the production of myths in order to remain vital and alive. Now, I presented this then as a kind of comparative philosophy, East and West, and I think the idea of comparison has come under critique itself very much in recent times among intercultural philosophers, including Julian. Also, An Chang, for example, another in France, who holds the chair of Chinese philosophy in the Collège de France. There's a strong tendency to want to reject comparison as a method, because comparison tends to posit objects that can be placed into comparison and to efface the dynamic connection between the cultures that are being compared and that can never really be seized as specific objects. It's always in some sort of a dynamic relationality in the inter, that they can interact, reveal their respective resources. This is very much in line with the method practiced by François Julian. He explains it, I think, most succinctly in his inaugural address for his chair of Altérité, Alterity, 2012, L'écart et l'entre, the gap and the between, is a manifesto essay for his form of intercultural philosophy. It's not a matter of specifying differences in order to compare one culture, one philosophy with another, because those differences are always parts of systems and paradigms. We have a taxonomy. Comparison seems to lend itself to this sort of static procedure, whereas the écart, the gap, the distance, makes the respective cultures interact with each other. It's in that dynamic engagement of one by the other that each can critique the other. The differences remain fluid. The respective cultures are not seen from any third paradigm, and that's where Julien would say, that's a transcendent paradigm, that has to be rejected. And this is where I have my tension with Julien. I think that his rejection of transcendence is itself an exclusionary maneuver, and that it is an impasse to the kind of dialogue that intercultural philosophy needs to seek. And there are many researchers that are now trying to defend the importance of transcendence in the Chinese tradition. There was this view, including Roger Ames and Hall, in the editor of this series. They too, like Julien, are rejecting any discourse of transcendence as having pertinence to Chinese philosophy. That is, it's wrong when you understand transcendence apophatically. A transcendence that is not specified, defined in formulas. It is that space of the beyond. That is crucial in Chinese philosophy. It is the very orientation to an other. It could be the other of the future. It can be another culture. It can also be the otherness of the whole, globality, the other with respect to any discourse that I'm able to articulate. I have to do that in finite terms, directed by certain choices and exclusions, but aiming at a globality which cannot be brought within the compass of any one concept. That is, to try to think beyond the confines of our concepts, to think in connection with, in dialogue with what they cannot say, is crucial to the approach of intercultural philosophy. This space between, it seems like an empty nothing, but it is the fertile womb of every kind of creative thinking that philosophy and culture are able to produce. It's as cultures differentiate themselves and distance themselves from one another that the terms of comparison and of contrast can be produced in that between, l'écart, the gap or distance, making a between. The between is not an empty space. It is actually the molten material from which all of our philosophical discourses can emerge, and the discourses of transcendence in our various cultures, in our religions, on both sides, East and West, monotheisms in the West, the Confucian, Taoist sensibility for the way, right, the way that can be said is not the universal, the constant way. There is this way beyond every way that can be said, and that is where these various cultures find something in common. It's a something in common, it's a nothing in common more profoundly, because it cannot be defined in any definitive terms. Now, we can raise the question then of why turn to China in particular for this philosophy. In Julien's case, he has a lot of reasons. The China, he says, is a culture that had no contact with the West in its classical period, starting with Matteo Ricci, some very limited exchange, but he takes it as the paradigmatic other that developed independently of Western culture, but that developed as sophisticated hermeneutic, interpretive apparatus. It's as intensively, its texts are intensively commentated, reflected on philosophically, and therefore it does give an external point of reference. This is at least his starting point. This of course has been critiqued. What he's taking then classical Chinese thought in isolation from its mediation by modernity, and that is something that certain critics will object to. I believe that's not completely right, that there is actually mediation by Julien's own contemporaneity. His contemporary postmodern French philosophy is very much in interaction with the classical Chinese sources. but he doesn't emphasize that. It works more behind the scenes. And this is why I do find myself profoundly in sync with his approach, and yet very much in opposition to the rejection of what I've been calling transcendence. I specify an apophatic transcendence that would be negative theology. It's not really the positive theological dogmas that I want to defend, although they offer us resources then in order to understand the purport of our cultures in negative theological terms. It is, negative theology brings us really to self-critique and even to infinite self-critique, which I believe is at the heart of intercultural philosophy. By comparing with other cultures, we're able to see our own culture, its limits. We're able then to relativize the terms that we've chosen and open up this space of alterity in which we can have an experience of truth, and I even understand this in mystical terms, in consonance with this tradition of apophatic, sometimes people say mystical, revelatory experience that is integral to philosophy at its early stages in both the Chinese traditions and in Western traditions, and even much more globally than that. Shamanism would also be a form. There's the cult of silence in shamanism or in Pythagoreanism is crucial to the kind of revelation in philosophy that we encounter along this route, this way that I'm calling my approach to intercultural philosophy. Now, let me then just finally show you the images that have not come up. Let me try here. And as I look at my watch, all right, that's the book that I have been introducing in this talk. This is its predecessor. This one is published by Notre Dame University Press. These are the volume. This is one volume, volume 1 of the 2007 work where this started, and there's a second volume as well. And yeah, these are the contents for the book that I've presented here. It moves from an interpretation of nature in the Chinese tradition, nature as nothing and the all, through poetic forms of making sense. This issue of immanence and then universalism is the destination for the intercultural philosophy as I've wanted to present it. So, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I met you at a Continental Philosophy Conference in Sydney a few years ago, and I was just briefly on the bus. I don't expect you to remember me. But subsequently I read your 3 previous books, which I loved, by the way. I've got 2 questions, if I may. One is that people are talking a lot about intercultural philosophy, and I'm wondering why I don't hear the phrase interreligious philosophy, and I'm wondering if there could be some value in the idea of interreligious philosophy. And my second question, which is kind of unrelated, but if I may, you're talking about negative philosophy. That tends to me to leave out half the picture. It tends to leave out the positive, the emphasis on the negative. Is there a bigger picture which can include the negative and the positive, the yin and the yang?
My whole aim is really to try to think inclusively, which in a certain sense is not possible. Any thinking is delimiting, and yet it wants to work against that tendency to limit itself by exclusion and to potentially be all-inclusive. We have to start with something. The negative is eminently positive. It's pointed that direction in this type of thinking. Even in the tradition of negative theology, it's recognized from early on. It's stated very emphatically in Dionysius the Areopagite that negative theology, apophatic theology, always presupposes cataphatic affirmative theology. You cannot have one without the other. The critical moment presupposes already some sort of a positive discourse that has to be then critiqued. So I think that's simply the necessity of choosing terms. And of course it's the context that determines which terms are going to be most efficacious. But you're absolutely right. When we're speaking, we're always leaving out half the picture. But that's why we speak in order to try and unspeak and open the mind to the other half. And as to the interreligious being perhaps as important as the intercultural, this is the fact that it's easier to speak of intercultural philosophy is that culture tends to be a more neutral term in our, at least in our Western context. In the Chinese context, philosophy and religion go very much together. And the program that I mentioned, having participated in and chaired for years in Macau, was a program of both philosophy and religious studies together. It's difficult to find them comfortably together in Western institutions. The history is really one of philosophy in some ways overcoming religion. So I think that that question points to the tension that I was speaking to in my presentation. And I would like to be able really to make religion in the root sense of religio, of tying together or tying us back to some kind of a source, a general cultural phenomenon and a universal phenomenon of culture, rather than a specific discipline cordoned off from the others. But that implies some transformations of what we understand in and by a term religion. So it's a term that really has to be on the way in evolution towards a greater openness in order to be taken on the way in which you very intriguingly suggest. Thank you.
Thank you.
Please, just to refer to your point of beginning, when you were saying that universal validity has been an aim of philosophy.
Didn't quite catch that. Say that again.
Universal validity, you said, has been an aim of philosophy. That's what you said.
Yes.
Yes, I agree with that. But do you take account of the import of hermeneutics? Hermeneutics
Yes.
instructs us that nobody speaks from nowhere.
Yes.
You have a context. It may seem to be extra or above context, but when you really examine more critically, you will see that either from the history, from the experience, from all sides, you will notice that the pretense, historical, that philosophy is universal may not be as clear as it seems.
Yes.
If Plato did not live in Athens, he would not have written the Republic, right?
Absolutely.
If Machiavelli did not live in his world, he would not have written the Prince.
Yes.
So you see then that well, the enunciation of the theory may seem to be above the East context.
Yes.
It may be desirable, but in fact, it is not in reality. Well, that may be a challenge, but I want you to...
No, that is a wonderful challenge, I think, and a very necessary one. And the very reason why philosophy to date has failed in its ambition to become universal, and the reason why it has to take a turn in this intercultural direction that I think we're trying to address in this session. Every philosophy has a context. It's not from nowhere. That's absolutely right. But of course, any definition of the context is also coming from somewhere. Where is that place? Whatever definition I give to it is only one possible way of defining it. There's some other space, an open space, between the various philosophies, the various paradigms that I can evoke. That space is what we share right now as we are dialoguing with one another, you on your terms, me on my terms, but there is some sort of a space between us that is the condition for the intelligibility of either of our discourses. And that's what we want to try and tune into, not only to our own specifically contextualized discourse, but also to this general open between, which is a context, but it's not just a context, it's not just a specific determinate context. It's some kind of, I can't define it. What could I say? An a priori condition for, okay, but any terms that I give to it are inadequate, and yet the fact of our speaking with one another and the intelligibility, the effort to render oneself intelligible, that is real between us. It doesn't have a name that is adequate, but I think we're approaching it. We're trying in thinking and unthinking the terms of intercultural philosophy. Is that universal? Any definition of universality, and the very term universality does have a history to it in a specific context which is limited. And so it's universality within quotation marks, opening it up to something that we no longer can strictly call universality, that I think we're aiming at as lovers of wisdom.